Announcing that one was wearing something solely for the comfort and safety of others, and then immediately taking said thing off, was, of course, sending a quite clear message to everyone in the room. Clearer than maybe even words could have conveyed. The gloves, or the breath filter in this case, had literally come off. It was, of course, a much more subtle way to send it than some others would have preferred. However, it still had its intended effect. A certain much-saying silence fell momentarily over the room as the Deathworlder's predatory gaze wandered through it, now unrestricted by tinted polymer or pretty lights hiding away its nature. Many of the present representatives surely had not quite forgotten James's announcement that, much like Miat, humans too were quite proficient in hunting their fellow Order members. Of course, concerns like that were in reality absolutely ridiculous, and everyone definitely should have known that James was not here to hunt anyone. However, that didn't mean that some of the more insistent instincts from generations past that still lingered in the backs of some of their minds didn't poke their ugly heads out into the light, now that the cold stare of the apex predator among the primates searched for any gaze that dared to challenge it. Few of them dared to even try, although they were all, in one way or another, important people that were used to having attention on themselves, and opposition pushing against them. They were also, in no uncertain terms, a bunch of spoilt, cloistered, and unworldly brats who had hidden away in their marble halls and ivory towers for so long that they had forgotten what the world could even look like outside of them. Clanifer tried his best to return James's challenging look. However, his discomfort could be clearly read on his face. His already squinting eyes narrowed even further, and his eyelids trembled as all four of his ears turned in James's direction to not let the predator out of their attention. Uton also averted his gaze, though with him it was clear that he didn't do so out of any sort of fear, but he instead simply did not wish to invite any more of the things James had to say to him out, seemingly not feeling like he could stand up to hearing most of them. The one that most comfortably faced James's searching eyes was Losovanaja. Not surprising, really. A Pixamaria who sat at the head of a hotel on a station run by predatory Deathworlders has surely seen a lot more frightening things than an ambassador that looked the slightest bit displeased at her. However, James then continued his earlier point about what was and wasn't one of his many mistakes, after a long moment of silence he had allowed himself. Whether you agree with me or not, it does not change the simple facts of the matter. Outer orbital strikes are illegal, period. People on Dunama, including parts of its leadership and children, got injured during a thwarted attempt of such an illegal attack. End of story. Everything else is rationalization. It does not matter if they were not the main target of the attack. It does not matter who or what else may have been present. We are here to discuss the united reaction of the Order of the Primates to the attack on Dunama. And the only reaction that there can be is the clear and unshakable condemnation and denunciation of this attack, and any of its kind, be it the same method or any other outlawed means of attack. Whether I like it or not, the primates are seen as a galactic role model. Many people do look towards us for guidance. If we do not send a clear signal that such an action cannot and will not be tolerated, then we will be putting the entirety of the galaxy's peace and order into jeopardy. There was a displeased rumble floating about the room at his words, and many of the present representatives, as well as their accompaniments, stood up in an uproar.
You still speak of galactic peace and order?
Galorable now fired back up, after having gotten over his first bit of disheartenment at James's earlier showmanship.
You, of all people, you who have single-handedly threatened the peace of the people to a degree that has not been seen in centuries, you who now speaks out in favor of one of the galactic community's oldest and most sworn enemies, you want to preach to us about peace and order?
James felt oddly in his element, as a dark, conniving smile crept over his face. Single-handedly. You shouldn't undersell yourself like that, Representative, he replied, with his shoulders lifted into a slight, leisurely shrug. You and your people, the captain especially, but also the High Matriarch of the Zodiatos, and several council people. You have all been more than pulling your weight when it comes to destabilizing the galaxy. In fact, I would say that you did the main bulk of the work. Me? I was merely there. Shaking his head and sighing amusedly, James then let his arm sink, moments before his gaze then turned stone cold. But fine. He then continued his rebuttal, now much more serious than before. Let's assume for a second that we aren't all allies here, that this wasn't a peaceful meeting of the different species of the Order simply to discuss how we should act with the galaxy's best in mind, and that there really was some sort of conflict happening right now that was much bigger than just caution and defense on humanity's part. Even then, condemning this attack would be absolutely essential for all of us. He wondered if he even needed to say any more than that. After all, it was quite obvious. However, some of the representatives around here had also proven to be rather dense. Still, James remained quiet for a time, simply wishing to observe for how many of the present people it would click. The implication being? The Mr. Cambridge representative was the first of those whose faces hadn't immediately darkened in understanding, who pulled together the nerve to ask. This time, Clanifer had seemingly understood it without problems. If this was a conflict, he said, using the same conjunctive that James was to keep things to a pure hypothetical, while two of his arms fiddled with each other, as the two others rubbed along his neck. Or if it could turn into one, then the galaxy's reaction to this first attack, if we want to call it that. He broke off his sentence, seemingly unwilling to speak it into existence. It would set the tone for the future conflict. Losaranaja finished the sentence for him, quickly granting herself speaking privileges as the host. If the very war crime, committed by one side, to start the conflict is not condemned, then what reason would there be to not return it in kind, apart from maybe a personal wish to be better? The Mr. Cumbridge's face shot around to James, and stared up at him with unblinking yellow eyes. Ambassador, you are not implying that, he said, in a burst of nervous energy that dissipated before he could even finish his sentence, causing his voice to slowly fade out, as James still refused to say anything until he was granted the word, sticking to the event rules as if superglued to them. I am not implying anything, James said, with a harsh emphasis on the word implying. I am stating that no matter what scenario you may believe is going on, either behind the scenes or elsewhere, there is only one reasonable action to such an attack. Like I have done from the very start, I might add. But I'm going to repeat it for the entire rest of the day, if I have to. We humans are quite tenacious, after all. Many of the representatives turned to mumble quietly with their company, and news reporters eagerly spoke into the cameras, surely all spinning their own story of what James's words could have meant. Did he want conflict? No. By no means, in fact. It was the furthest thing from his mind to even allow the thought of it being a valid possibility here. However, the idea that he might be willing to cause one was a useful tool by itself. Even though demonstrations had been rare, by now the galaxy had gotten a chance to get a taste of humanity's weaponry. Would it be enough to fight the entire rest of the galaxy head-on? Of course not. Numbers didn't lie. No matter the advantage their weapon technology would buy them, they were so horribly outnumbered that any chance of victory was basically a rounding error. However, sometimes the question that people in front of the many screens across the galaxy asked themselves, when they heard about talks like that, wasn't could they actually win, but tended to be more along the lines of, who will be the one to take the hit if they try? Because while it was absolutely true that the community technically had more than enough bodies to throw at any given problem, The approach of trying to see if you had more men, or the machine gun above the trench had more bullets, wasn't exactly the prettiest. Especially not if outer orbital bombardments would become a valid option in the conflict. After all, even planets were far from indestructible if the very laws of nature were already being bent to one's will. "The galaxy's eyes are on us today," James announced to the room, while using his best narrator voice, doing his best to sound utterly impartial for a moment. "You know my stance on the matter, of course. You know that, and how I would judge you, given whatever views you may hold. That I would much rather be judged for my character, flawed as it might be, than by the place that I was born. That I would see the unwarranted violence against those who think and act differently from the accepted norm punished and ceased. Yes, that I stand against the proposed homogeny and grey sludge of a culture that oh so many seem to wish to promulgate across the community, and instead wish to invite and celebrate the many different lives and ways that have led us all to the stars. Celebrate it as a true community, not a homogeny. And that I wish to be open to the new and the unusual, hopefully allowing it to enrich our lives. You all already know this, and usually I would gladly and fervently fight every single one of you for that simple goal." However, he closed his eyes for a second, releasing a breath before he continued. "However," he said, and immediately paused again to give the words its necessary weight after such a declaration. "Right now, I do not care what your views on the treatment of Deathworlders may be." He reached his left hand out to gently hold Sheila by the shoulder as she sat beside him. "I don't care what your opinions on augmentations and those who choose to accept them on their bodies might be," he continued, raising his mechanical arm, making a wide arc with it to present it to the entire room, before finally ending with a brief gesture in Curie's direction. "I don't care whether or not you think an amiable artificial sapient is something that could exist or not," he added, lifting both arms to gesture more towards the entire open room. "And I especially do not care whatsoever what you may or may not think of me personally," he finished, bringing both arms back down to his chest to point at himself. "All I care about right now is that right now there is, as is so rarely the case, a clear right and a clear wrong. In more ways than one, the damage is already done. All we can hope to do now is mend as much as we can while we still can, lest we allow it to spread to our load-bearing structure. Some people here might see this event as a political instrument, but I do not." He not so subtly glanced over at the captain and his representative. "Hate me if you like. Hate those I associate with if you like. That is something that may concern us at another time. But please, right now, don't make the galaxy suffer for it." James then addressed everyone again, and he even caught the gaze of some cameras pointed directly at him as he spoke. "No matter what you think who is fighting, who or what sides you may think there are, and which of these sides you think yourself on, the rules of war must stand. Because, no matter who it is that topples them, as soon as they fall, the galactic community will eventually fall with them." Although the weight of the importance of all of this was still very much pressing down on him, and James would honestly still much rather have been basically anywhere else, instead of standing here in front of the galaxy while giving important yet heavy-handed speeches, he did have to admit, monologuing like that was actually kind of fun. No wonder politicians like to hear themselves talk so much. However, by now, it was actually starting to wonder just how many times he could reiterate what was basically the same point, in different fancy ways. Or how often he would have to, before it would hopefully sink in with everyone that he was being serious here. It honestly wasn't that hard, after all. Not to mention that no one had actually even really tried to refute him yet. Not that there was much to refute here, but they could at least pull some bullshit reasoning out of their ass, instead of just sticking to James bad or AI bad here. After all, Even if they didn't believe that Avezalon was 100% harmless, much like James still didn't think that, anyone, at the very least, had to admit that Dunama was, in fact, not currently a smouldering pile of ashes, or in the process of purging all of its systems in a coordinated cyber attack against the Realized, meaning she had to at least be different from the others they knew somehow. Pausing his heartfelt speech-giving for a while, to give people time to process, James used the moment of respite to scan across the faces of his company. Well, those who were visible, anyway. The breath filters of his human accompaniment still only let through the basic projections of their professionally stern faces. Well, that was with the exception of Nia, of course. After an early very clear shock and disbelief at what James had presented here, she had eventually calmed down again, although an air of an underlying uncertainty that bordered on disapproval has still remained for a time. However, now that she had heard him talk and give his reasons for a while, the light pixels on her mask had more and more mellowed out, and were now stuck in an expression somewhere in between a "you got this" and a "let's see where this goes." Although Curie's face was of course basically impossible to read, given that it didn't demote at all, James noticed that the cyborg stance was remarkably confident, considering the amount of people they had to present themselves in front of. The knees of their massive backward legs were less bent than usual, pushing their body up higher than they normally carried themselves, in a way that James equated to pushing one's chest out. Moore seemed to be far from happy about the current turn of events. However, James was truly relieved to see that the main bulk of that unhappiness seemed to stem mostly from stress and a general discomfort brought on by it, instead of any aversion to what James was saying. Of course, a bit of background noise of worry and slowly creeping dread remained on the old woman's face, as her head turned sideways so one of her eyes could fully focus on him, while one of her clawed hands loudly clacked along one of her notched horns. However, it didn't seem like she was ready to turn heel and abandon James, with his self-made problems yet. And, well, Conglorch was smiling. It was hard to tell with the reptile's armor skin and stiff lips. However, something about the way his mouth stood half opened, presenting rows of sharp teeth to the world, was a bit different than usual. There was almost a sense of triumph in it. Or at least James thought so. Tonastrocyte expressions weren't exactly something he had a huge amount of expertise in reading. The mumbling and general prattle in the room stayed quite intense for a while, but even so, James remained quiet, still unwilling to speak up and interrupt the proceedings, even if just while whispering to his friends. He would have to see what they thought at a later time, in private, where he could also apologize for having to have kept this from many of them for so long. It was good that it was finally out. Maybe he would even introduce Avezalon to them, who knew? She could surely use a couple more friends, although Moore might not quite be ready for that yet. The old lady had gotten a whole lot more tolerating, ever since he had met her, of course. But to realize wanting to have chit-chat might still cross a bit of a line for now. He would have to ease her into this. Curie, on the other hand, would likely be completely on board. Or at least James assumed that they would. Thinking of it, he had never really talked to them about artificial sapiens before. He just kind of assumed it would be an enticing idea to them, since they enjoyed anything technological so much, and also generally fell out of line with what the galaxy did and did not find acceptable. However, it was entirely possible that any experiences or stories that may be ingrained into them could have made them just as averse to the artificial life form as most other people were. James doubted it, but it was possible. After all, Nia also wasn't generally someone who judged others before getting the full picture, but even she had some very choice opinions about AIs. He knew that much. Not that the same wasn't true for James before he had met Avezalon, of course. Basically every human had grown up with stories about Michael, after all. and with the rest of the galaxy corroborating the idea that realized were generally aggressive maniacs, nothing had ever quite challenged those stories. Everyone else, of course, already knew of Ezelon. Well, except for Conglorge. However, he wasn't the most personable person at the best of times, so James couldn't quite imagine how trying to introduce him to Ezelon as a potential friend would. James suddenly snapped up, as the feline tail subtly bumped against his side, with much more force than it usually exerted. Apparently, Sheeta had decided to be a bit more innocuous than an elbow to the side would have been. Damn it. Had he zoned out? Well, yeah, he had. But what did he miss? Who was talking right now? The sound of the surrounding world, gradually returning to his ears in a wave of noise, made it hard to focus on the main voice that was currently speaking to the room, and so James quickly had to follow everyone's gazes to see where they were looking in order to find the speaker. However, there wasn't really a speaker right now, but there was definitely somebody everyone was looking at. Admittedly, James probably should have noticed them immediately on his own, because they were entirely out of place. With silverish grey fur and dark rust-red markings, the lecture set that had, from James's perspective, popped up from thin air in the middle of the room, but who had in reality most likely simply entered while he had been distractedly wandered lost in his own mind, differentiated themselves quite a bit from their conspecifics that James had met so far. They had for the species, a rather broad head, and their solid green eyes had an almost olive colour to them. Said eyes were locked firmly onto Losseranaja, as the Deathworlder leaned in to the small primate and whispered something into her ear. Next to him, James could see Sheeta's own listening apparati interestedly twitch. However, he doubted that even she would be able to pick up on what was whispered that far away from them. However, although he had less chance of hearing anything that was being said, James also leaned in the direction of the conversation suspiciously, wondering whatever could be discussed at a moment like this. Eventually, Losseranaja nodded, whispered something back to the lecture set, and then turned to look up in James's general direction. Ambassador Aldwin and Representative Gloribal, could I maybe bother the both of you and your company to step down to me for a second? She loudly asked the leader of the two adjacently seated groups, up on the top rungs. Inadvertently, James and Gloribal looked over at each other, clearly trying to see if the other party had anything to do with this interruption. James obviously hadn't, and at least if he could believe that face he was making, it seemed that Gloribal didn't either, although there was a fair chance that he was just acting. Turning to his company with a movement of his head, James then indicated for everyone to get up while he pushed himself to his feet. Quickly, a protective formation was formed around him and his civilian company by the guards, who covered every angle of their descent down to the lower level with unshaking vigilance. Admittedly, for a moment, the urge to simply jump over the railing and thus be down with Losseranaja within a second was quite alluring to James. After all, he had almost made a habit of jumping and climbing around in lower gravities like this one, at this point. However, keeping up appearances prevailed over convenience for the time being, and so he decided to not pull a stunt like that after such a serious request from his host. Instead, the human procession quickly and orderly made their way down the stairs, closely followed by that of the Cimareskis. Seemingly bored by the previous proceedings, and intrigued by what was going on, Skye hurried a bit ahead of her group to catch up with her fellow Deathworlders, quickly reaching Tuya, who was forming the anchor position in their current formation. James gave the inquisitive deer an acknowledging nod for a second. However, otherwise his eyes were curiously directed at the other out-of-place Deathworlder that had interrupted their proceedings. The lecture set was turning their entire head around like an owl to keep their eyes on the descending groups, and the expression on their face was serious. As the approaching groups were only a couple of measures away anymore, Lossa Renaja hopped off her podium and quickly hurried into their direction on all sixes, coming to a stop barely in front of James, before subtly indicating with her two lower arms that it might be best if someone would lift her up. Not hesitating to do so, James leaned down and pressed his organic arm to her, allowing her to hold on and climb up the limb, while James lifted her up into the air. Then, even if slightly begrudgingly so, he took her closer to the other representative. With the Pixomeria on James's shoulder, and the Simioreskis walking on all fours, all of the primates were more or less on the same level, and could therefore stand with their faces closely together, as Lossa Renaja began whispering to them. "Apparently, active threats have started to reach the security of the station regarding the both of you," she quickly said, without wasting any time with preamble. "Investigations are ongoing, but apparently some of the threats were deemed substantial enough that it was deemed by security that it would be irresponsible to let this conference go on, as it does, for any longer. We do not wish to exclude you from the proceedings, however, and therefore you will be escorted to a more secure location from where you may rejoin the conference remotely. Rister Farrow here has his team waiting just outside and is ready to immediately escort you there." James furrowed his brow, while Glorabal turned to whisper something to Uton behind a lifted hand, although the captain could only shake his head with an unsure expression. "And do we not get a say in the matter?" James then asked, crossing his arms. "Personally, I've not made the best experiences with being escorted or confined by station security." While that was true, a much larger concern of his was to be confined in close quarters with these people, and that concern wasn't exactly for himself. "Any other course of action would be highly inadvisable." Rister Farrow chimed into the conversation, his large ears twitching and turning at the room's noise. "If you are not compliant with safety measures, we would sadly have to escort you off the station for your own safety. Net Staniot station security will not be responsible for any harm that befalls the Ambassador of Humanity." His gaze was firm, and his voice didn't exactly sound like he would allow much room for argument there. James sighed, and massaged his brow with his mechanical hand, seeing as the other shoulder was currently occupied. "Thoughts?" he then asked, turning towards his company, with a specific gaze at Shida, Andresh and Coco. Andresh rubbed the back of his head in thought, moving some of his long hair around in the process. "Personally, I wouldn't mind leaving if we have to," the Major explained honestly, with a tone that told of him not liking this new situation at all. However, after adding a shrug, he ended his sentence with, "But we should probably stick around if we can." Coco nodded. "As long as we tell Earth to send the biggest ship we have if we don't show back up on that broadcast in the next 10 minutes or so, we should be fine," she suggested casually. "If they want to mess with that, it's their own fault." James nodded at the assertions of his higher-ranking friends. However, then he once again turned towards Shida with an empathic look on his face. "Treasure?" he asked softly, remembering her earlier demeanor, and how much worse those feelings could become if allowed to stir in close proximity and without a way out. Shida looked around for a bit, studying his face at first, before turning to throw a clearly heavily held back look, with an empty expression, over at Uton. "I'll be fine," she then said, with a just as empty but definitely decided tone. "This is important." James wondered if it would be better to resist here, because although Shida seemed sure about it for the most part, he wasn't exactly certain if she should. However, he didn't want to go against her like that. If she felt that she could handle this, he should support her, while also keeping an eye open in case she had misjudged things. Assuming things wouldn't immediately go to hell as soon as they had reached the secure location that the local security had in mind, they would hopefully still be able to pull out and leave the station instead if things did turn too overwhelming for the feline. Therefore, James grit his teeth before turning back to the lecture set. "I'll have to make a quick call, but we'll come with you," he announced, to which the Vulpine firmly nodded.
We will of course also come, Golorabo announced, not even a second after. Lead the way.
After James had quickly allowed Lossaranaja to climb off his shoulder again, and then made a prepare-for-anything call back to Earth, the now involuntarily combined human and Simioreski's groups were ushered outside by Ristafaro, where, just as promised, a larger group of Laxaset security was already waiting for them. The Volpine Deathworlder's green, stiff eyes eerily stared at the emerging primates as they walked out of the conference room. Despite the added safety, the human soldiers still moved in their defensive formation to make completely sure that no harm would befall their ambassador. Although, at least to a degree, the Laxaset appeared to be professionals, as they avoided taking the threatened dignitaries to the outside, where they could possibly easily be picked off by a sufficiently equipped threat. Instead, they were led underground, meaning deeper into the hull of the station. James was all too familiar with this sort of area in a station by now. After all, he had used it to quite efficiently traverse the GCS when he himself did not want to be found. In that sense, they offered a certain comfort. It seemed that once again this path was quite effective, with avoiding any sort of contact with unwanted people, and so their travel was rather undisturbed as they made their way towards whatever destination security had planned for them. "What kind of threats are we talking about exactly?" Coco eventually asked, seemingly both out of sincere interest in an urge to prepare herself for eventualities, evenly mixed with a sheer desire to fill the tense dead air that had formed, as it seemed that neither party really wanted to talk all that much, while the other was this close by. "I'm sad to say, too many to concisely list," Ristafaro replied, with a resigned squeaking noise. "We will gladly brief you once we have reached our destination. For now, let's focus on getting you there without incident." "Ominous," Coco replied, with an eye roll and a grimace, the humour in her voice poorly hiding her annoyance. "At least the big lugs will be nice bullet sponges when it comes to it," Admir whispered in English, as he leaned in towards James, inconspicuously nodding in the Cimareski's direction. James gave him the most tired hint of a smirk as an answer, making full use of the fact that his face was now freed from masking constraints. Then he suddenly noticed that Shida had suddenly disappeared out of his periphery. In a moment of shock, his eyes quickly shot over towards Uton, who was walking some measures in front of him, and keeping his gaze forward. Not there, luckily. Beginning to search around in other places after the first skip beats of his heart, James's eyes then soon enough landed on the dark shape of his girlfriend again. In actuality, Shida had barely moved at all. She had just slowed her steps ever so slightly, allowing herself to fall back a measure or so that she now walked along with a much larger, but just as dark, from next to her. "You're looking good," Skye commented, as her doe eyes looked down at the feline, her head turning in a way that stretched one of her antlers far into the air. "And you're still growing like a weed, I see," Shida commented back, her voice restrained and cordial. "How are you holding up?" Her ears twitched once, and the movement was mirrored by the many flaps of the Ketsirs, in a wave-like motion. "Been better," she replied with a shrug, her dialect still on full display in many spoken words, despite Reprieve's best efforts to educate her. "But also been much worse. Food comes easy now." Shida nodded. "I bet it does," she said, still very clearly holding a lot back. "And other stuff?" Skye released a raspberry-like sound. "Water's fine. Bit boring at times, though. Don't hold a candle to the stuff you're doing, I bet," the former thief explained, with an enthusiastic nudge in Shida's direction. "But beats the brick or taking arms." Shida exhaled slowly. "Does it?" she asked, in a raspy sound under her breath. "Sure," Skye said nonchalantly. "Kevin's nice, long as he wants something. Wants something most of the time, so he's not too bad." Shida visibly clenched her jaw and shut her eyes tightly, clearly doing her best to thoroughly prepare to reply something that was well thought out. However, Sky was quite a bit faster. "Don't worry," she said, in a casual yet calming manner. "I know he's got a few screws loose, but I'm a diver. I can watch out for it. Besides, someone has to keep an eye on him." "That someone should be an armed guard in front of a door without a key," Sheeta replied to that. However, James only understood as much because he was watching her as she spoke, and could follow the movements of her mouth, because she was speaking so quietly that it was barely in his audible range, even while standing almost right next to the conversation. "Long as it pays for work, I can fill that part as well," Sky replied jovially with a snicker. Then her gaze slowly snuck downwards, towards the holstered weapon on Sheeta's hip. "We need someone to hand me a gun, though." In a more genuine movement of emotion, Sheeta gave a scoffing chuckle through her teeth. "Keep dreaming," she replied to the cheeky doe before her. James could already tell that this was going to be an oh-so-fun evening.